Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today we will discuss Emmanuel Macron's latest speech about the future of Europe. Then we will begin to unpack the EU parliamentary elections set to take place in a few weeks. And we'll look through the latest polling figures and Ursula von der Leyen's chances of securing a second term as Commission president. Finally, we will talk briefly about Xi Jinping's trip to Europe this week, and then we will turn to a conversation with Rebecca Christie, senior fellow at Bruegel, for a conversation about the Enrico Letta report in the European single market. We hope you enjoy the show. Donatien, let's talk about Macron's Sorbonne 2.0 speech. This speech had a huge amount of hype for it. It's in the main auditorium at the Sorbonne, which is a
really big
auditorium.
Academic institution in France political discussions.
The auditorium is, when you think of a big speech in France in a grand setting, it is what you imagine. What was the speech about? Why did he give it? What did he say? If that can be encapsulated.
I'll try. As we say in French, je vais la faire courte, just because Macron did not do it briefly. But this comes 7 years after his first Sorbonne speech. And both of these are really meant to elaborate his vision for the European Union and Europe as a continent more broadly, because it's not just current EU members, it's also the ones we envision being members soon or in the near-ish future. It was a very long speech. I was a little nervous when they started pitching the speech and talking about it, because I thought, oh my God, another hour and a half of Emmanuel Macron talking about his own vision that is basically France for the EU. And I'm pleasantly surprised. I didn't think it was a French speech for the European Union as much as he has been known to do in the past. I thought it was really powerful and well crafted. Once again, this is my opinion, a coherent vision for the European Union that connects very well to the different efforts that are going on. The Letta report that we'll talk about in the interview with Rebecca, Mario Draghi's upcoming report, things like that. And obviously all the debates we're having on European defense. So that's what made it very coherent for me. And the structure, I think, is well done because he first talks about successes of recent years for the European Union, which I think is important because, as he talks about later, Europe right now is in doubt of itself and really easily leaning into this sucks, everything is not good. So those successes, among others, financial unity, strategic unity, planning for big challenges like the green transition, etc. And then he talks about the reason why there needs to be more done at the European Union level, which is big changes in the rules of the world. And in that, he talks about security and defense, economy and trade, and then culture/values and democracy. And his response to this is a three-part response, and I'll stop there in terms of describing what he talks about, which is 1, power. So that's defense, diplomacy, etc. 2, prosperity. That's the whole file on trade policy, growth, green transition, simplifying regulations, energy, innovation, all this stuff. And then the last one is humanism or humanism, and that's all the cultural and values piece on the importance of a pan-European vision for the future, for children, for the next generation, common museums or libraries, things like that, that really reinvigorates an idea of European values, but also European democracy at a critical juncture where a lot of people are doubting the values of liberal democracy for citizens. And honestly, I think he does that really well with specific policy ideas in some places. Some are very aligned with Enrico Letta's report. Others are very French. So leaning into the nuclear energy proposition, for example, or big economic champions. But overall, he highlights the importance of doing all of this in a European context.
You know, what was fascinating to me about the speech is basically watching European reaction to it and the kind of European Brussels think tank commentariat getting sort of super hyped as this is sort of the Super Bowl, but really more like a European State of the Union address. Now, of course, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, gives a State of the Union address usually in September. We covered that last time. But what is sort of missing in Europe, and this is where I really commend Macron, is someone coming forth with a big vision and then laying it all out or laying out many different things and then having a debate about it. And oftentimes the European discussion about Europe's future is not actually discussed because Europe just sort of deals with issues as it comes. Because if you discuss big strategic things like what is the direction of Europe, then what happens is you're getting yourself potentially into political trouble. Are you talking about a federal Europe? Oh my God, what about the capacity of the nation state? And then you start heading down sort of a Brexitean path.
And it's easier for him than von der Leyen to do that.
Right, no, exactly, because he's Macron, he's in his second term. I mean, he did this in his first term. But what we sort of forget is that I view him as effectively having saved the European Union. That his election in 2017, coming on the heels of Brexit, it was Marine Le Pen. There was huge momentum for further exits, and he doubled down and ran on a pro-European platform. And then he gave this grand Sorbonne speech, which was then basically ignored by Angela Merkel and the Germans. And fortunately, I think that's sort of going to be the case this time. But what I think this speech does ahead of the European parliamentary elections is sort of lay out, here's a big path that we can go on. Now, I think the fundamental problem, and this is not just for Macron, but for French leadership in Europe in general, is they quickly blend French national interest and European national interest together. Then what happens is they're sort of very brazen about it, and that turns off Europeans. And then there's also this internal contradiction where sometimes Europeans will grab on to a part of the French vision for Europe, but then take out the French part effectively, or the part that really benefits France from a really parochial perspective. And then suddenly Paris will be, sort of concerned about it. And I think we saw some of this with the reaction to the European defense industrial strategy, which on the one hand, you would think a very French idea and very much is. On the other hand, would actually have real implications for the French state-owned defense industry and potentially losing some power. That's a sort of a side issue. But in general, this is the sort of thing we should encourage European leaders to do, lay out big ideas. Now, there's some internal contradictions, again, pointed out by smart think tankers especially on the economic side about what he's proposing. But there's a lot on the agenda on the EU level, which we'll talk about in our conversation. But it also previews what is coming, which is European parliamentary elections. And we're now in the throes of vigorous, well, I don't know about vigorous.
I don't know about vigorous.
But they're happening.
Yeah.
Europeans are going to go to the polls in early June.
Yes,
450 million of them. And one included, maybe Ottawa are pretty sure as well. Yeah, so we'll have a couple people in the studio.
If I may, just one last thing on the Macron speech is just from the U.S. perspective. I think what's valuable too is he has a good grasp of U.S. priorities in the long term. He talks very clearly about, the interests in the U.S. are twofold. One, the U.S., legitimately. Two, China. And we have to make changes because of that. Now, I'll say he bemoans the bipolar world order, but he constantly talks about just the U.S. and China, but we can set that aside. Anyway, I just thought for our U.S.-based audience, it's important to understand that because it's valuable.
I think he's right about that. Macron has been pushing strategic autonomy since he became...
And now strategic ambiguity.
Yeah. And I think the basic point there is just that I think Europe does have an interest in being able to act as Europe. And that's basically what he's pushing. And the U.S. has sort of been very nervous about that because if Europe can act as Europe doesn't need the United States. My view is that Europe acting as Europe doesn't mean it will be against the U.S. interests. And at times, Macron and the French go into this sort of anti-Americanism.
It's just deeply rooted. They can't really get rid of all of it. Yeah. But another connection that's interesting to me between the EU Parliament election and his speech is he talks about the importance of PanEuropean lists, for example. But we see in the debate that just happened among all of the leads of parties that are supposedly vying to be the next president of the Commission is the Spitzenkandidat system is still kind of broken.
In the Spitzenkandidat system, that's a German word for basically the lead candidate. That basically the lead candidate of the party, of the European party that gets the most votes, should be the candidate. And this sort of broke down in 2019 after the European People's Party
completely sidelined.
Yeah, Manfred Weber, a German politician who was their lead candidate. And basically, I think it was essentially Macron nixed him. And then they had a negotiation and came out with von der Leyen in the end. And it's sort of been this awkward re-election for von der Leyen where she sort of is now campaigning as the Spitzenkandidatin for the EPP, but isn't really out there as much. I would say this is where the European parliamentary elections are increasingly important yet increasingly have this juvenile feel to it. It feels a little bit like a middle school election where people are sort of embarrassed to be out there politicking, and it's sort of unclear how to do it. And partly, when you mention the nationalists, maybe you should describe that. Like, how do you actually vote? You're going to vote in Belgium. So are you voting for Ursula von der Leyen?
Well, no, she's not on my ballot.
Yeah, so exactly. You don't need to declare who you're going to vote for.
To explain to people, basically, I will be voting at the consulate here in DC, and on my ballot, Belgium has federal elections synced to the European elections, so that's part of it.
At the Belgian consulate.
Yes, correct. They're not at the European delegation.
Yes.
But for the European elections, for the parliament, that part of the ballot is parties that are active in Belgium that I'm able to vote for. Because there are no transnational parties in Europe still to this day, there are some that have tried to have, some kind of alignment. Obviously, every party has to declare an affiliation or no party, I guess, at the European Parliament. So you know which party is going to give seats to which big group. So it would be the EPP or the Socialists and Democrats or Renew Europe or the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists. So if you're somewhat informed as a voter, you will know, okay, this party has declared with this group, so I want my vote to go to this European Parliament group. But they are national parties, which is also why every time a lot of these candidates on the lists end up running a primarily national campaign, or they try to surf the wave of national resentment. They can have a European platform, I would hope so if they are running for a European list, but they're using debates that are happening at the national level to campaign at the European level.
For example, like in France, I think Macron's party is going to do quite poorly. It's the expectation. Marine Le Pen's party is going to do quite well. And in part, it's not really driven by what anyone's campaigning on. It's just that incumbents are not that popular. It's sort of a midterm election. This is an opportunity to sort of take a whack at Macron. Someone from Spain who I met with recently thinks Ursula von der Leyen is doing quite well, but he never vote for the PP, which is the center-right party in Spain. And so, imagine in the U.S. context, if you're actually the Republican president of the North American Council is doing, quite well, and you kind of like them, and they're very moderate. They're kind of like Mitt Romney. But, as a Democrat, I could never vote for the Republican side or vice versa. And that's sort of the issue with not having these national lists. So it becomes this very national election.
In U.S. terms, to do that, you would need to get a lot more split ticket voters, basically. Yeah. In Europe, to have someone think, okay, the one I really want is Ursula von der Leyen. I'll bite the fact that my vote goes to EPP for that. But every other election that's relevant, if there are some in some countries and not just European Parliament elections, then I'll vote for the other parties.
Yeah, and it's also one of these issues that is developing, and we talked about it with Reem Montez, who came on our show, about the European media landscape. What is the media landscape in Europe? Well, it's done at the national level, so politics is done at the national level. And the number of news outlets in Brussels, there are some political EU, Euronews, there's EU Active. So there's a number, but they're not read at the scale. And this is where, it's essentially like a confederation type setup where the political action still takes place at the states. But each European election becomes more and more interesting because actually the stakes for Europe are higher and higher. And the outcome of this election will be really significant. And so the big debate right now is that if the far right's doing well, there's a couple different far right political groupings, and there's sort of internal squabbling within the far right parties, whether it's Meloni or Le Pen. There's this question of how the far right unites post-election.
That reconfiguration potentially of the parliament is really important, and that's why I think we're spending so much time talking about these elections, is because the impact itself is, one, obviously the symbol it sends or it presents for democratic health across the European Union and what voters decide to vote for in terms of platform. But two, importantly, is including through Macron's speech, for example, we're talking about all these big reforms that we would like to see at the European Union level. A lot of these, investments, competitiveness, defense, the European Parliament has to approve legislation for this and more money for it. So depending on the coalitions that can be formed in the Parliament, either you can push forward that agenda that has the vision for the long term, or it looks very different. It looks less pro-Europe. It's less pro-climate transition. It's less pro-Ukraine potentially.
Maybe we'll touch briefly on Xi Jinping's visit to Europe this week. Now, he has just arrived in Paris. We're recording on Monday, May 6th. Now, this comes on the heels of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz traveling to China. And Scholz got a lot of criticism because on his trip, it seemed like he soft-pedaled the harder issues. Now, maybe he mentioned them behind closed doors, but it looks like this was very much a trip about trying to keep the economic door open for German businesses in China, something we've heard before. So he brought a big delegation with him. Now, we know that Washington is really concerned about the increase in Chinese exports to Russia that basically has been going on the last year. That's fueled Russia's defense industry and it's enabled its war in Ukraine. So this is a major topic that I think Macron will bring up. And then also there's been a lot happening that we've talked about on the show previously about China and dumping of electric vehicles, that basically having subsidized them and undercutting European cars. So there's a lot on the table for Europe to discuss economically. And when it comes to Russia, so Macron is going to really put that on the table. Von der Leyen is there with him. Scholz turned down the invitation to show up as well. So it kind of looks like Europe's divided. And then Xi Jinping's the rest of his trip when he leaves Paris, and they're also, I think, going, spend a delightful day in the mountains. He's going to go to Belgrade for the 25th anniversary of the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo War, and then to Budapest, where China is setting up a lot of factories. Serbia, outside the EU, definitely hedging, and then you have Hungary opening its door to Chinese investment and sort of demonstrating it's willing to be China's Trojan horse in Europe as well as Russia's.
Those two will definitely be more friendly visits, I think, than in Paris. Not that it will be unfriendly in Paris, but I think in a way, Macron positioned himself quite well to receive that visit on the heels of this big speech, because he talks very clearly about China not following the rules and trying to set a different kind of model. And his invitation of both Scholz and von der Leyen, even if only one of the two is coming, I think is also a sign that he wants to keep making this European. And I think that's positive. That's why it's, I think, less concerning that this visit is happening.
Yeah. Maybe just one last thought on this is that I think there's a sense in Washington that Europe actually has some leverage with this in the China relationship, that if we push Beijing, we as the Americans, to not provide dual-use exports to Russia and throttle some of its economic and technological support, that it will have no impact on Beijing. But if the Europeans do that, it will make a difference. 13, 14 months ago, we were really concerned about China providing lethal weapons to Russia. It did not do that. And I actually think Macron's trip, which was panned at the time because it was fairly weak on Taiwan.
And we talked about it.
Yeah, we talked about it with our colleague Jude Blanchette, who we'll try to have back on the show. I think that made a difference. It sort of sent a signal to China, this is Europe's red line. We don't want to cross it. And I think China thinks that it can maybe wedge the U.S. and Europe, particularly in a post-Trump sort of environment. So I think China thought, well, it's not providing lethal assistance to Russia. The Europeans can't really get upset with it. I think from our view, it's time for Europe to move its red line and tell China that this is a big deal if it's going to really fuel Russia's war.
Ahead of the next sanctions package, too.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk more about Xi's trip. We'll see how it goes, and we'll track it throughout the week, but we'll talk about it perhaps on the next episode. But now's a good time to transition to our conversation with Rebecca Christie, who's a senior fellow at Bruegel, to talk all things about the Enrique Letta report and basically the future of the European single market, which is what that report was about trying to essentially revive.
We are thrilled to be joined by Rebecca Christie for a conversation about the European single market and its competitiveness. Rebecca is a senior fellow at Bruegel and hosts Bruegel's podcast, The Sound of Economics. She's also the Brussels columnist for Reuters' Breaking Views. She writes about the crossroads of markets, policy, and politics, particularly where it comes to the European Union and how it interacts with the world. She was lead author on the European Stability Mechanism's official history book, Safeguarding the Euro in Times of Crisis, the Inside Story of the ESM. Over more than 2 decades in journalism, Rebecca has reported from Brussels, Washington, and around the world for Bloomberg News, Dow Jones Newswires, The Wall Street Journal, and The Financial Times. Rebecca, welcome to the Eurofile.
Thank you. So glad to be on your show.
I want to set the stage for this report that Enrico Letta, who's the former prime minister of Italy, wrote for the single market. In 2023, the European Council called for an independent high-level report on the future of the single market to be presented at a meeting in 2024, which is where we are now, and wanted to really move forward the work on understanding how to deepen the single market, understanding the current flaws, etc. They wanted some concrete and ambitious recommendations, and the report, I would say, delivered. It is 170-something pages. It goes across a range of issues, and really the idea is how do we make the single market fit for the 21st century, for a global stage that is quite different than when the single market was initially started in terms of security, trade, and demographics. So that's where we are now. The report has been released. There's been a lot of analysis out there, so we wanted to talk about that. And I think you're the great person for us to do that with. So when you think about this report, how do you assess overall the feasibility of the recommendations that Letta put forward? Because there are a lot, and some of them are really ambitious. But he also, in the preamble, tries to say that he's hoping to stay within the confines of what's currently possible with the institutions. What's your assessment of what's doable here with these recommendations?
The way to approach this report is to see it as a menu of possibilities for European policymakers to choose from. It has gotten some blowback for not having a ranked prioritization of recommendations, for not having firm conclusions at the end of what to do and when to do it, of just throwing a bunch of stuff out there. I happen to believe that throwing a bunch of stuff out there was really a smart move on Letta's part. There's nothing bad in this report, which is a great thing to be able to say. When you go through these 170 pages, there are some things where you think, yeah, that's a great idea. We could do that really soon. There are other things where you think that's a great idea. It's never going to happen. There's nothing in there where you think, wow, that's awful. And just the absence of howlers is really a strength in something like this, because it means when people come back to it in future years, and they will, because the single market has been developing over decades. As you may remember, many of the things that he's brought up have been things that people have been talking about for decades. So when people consult this as a reference document, there will be a bunch of good and useful ideas, and they can see how they fit the needs of the time.
This report, I mean, it strikes me, just to put it in kind of a U.S. context, a Washington context, it's probably sort of similar to the Simpson-Bowles Commission report, which was to look at the debt and deficit back, more than 15 years ago after the 2008 financial crisis, and came out with all these recommendations, and sort of charted a path forward that then basically wasn't really followed by legislatures. But maybe we can back up even further. So, we talk a lot about the European single market. And that essentially in the 1980s, the Single European Act, actually pushed by Margaret Thatcher. And the idea was that you're going to integrate European, all these different national markets into one big single market. But what this report basically highlights is you have a single market in some areas, but not in others. And so there's, when we talk about a European market, oftentimes folks in Europe find that it isn't actually European. It's quite national. And maybe you could talk about the broader kind of structural challenges right now. And we had Terry Breton here at CSIS more than a year ago, and I kind of asked him about the classic question that, or a comment made by American commentators about lack of European innovation and other things like that, and especially about the social media apps. And his broader point was, well, you have a country of 300 million people that all speak the same language. Like, how are we going to do that in Europe? And that, I think, speaks to some of the challenges of the single market, where if you had a French language social media app, it wasn't going to do very well in Germany. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the structural issues here as Europe is trying to think through how to kind of move its single market forward.
I am so glad you brought that up, because it's a conversation we need to be having. And it's a conversation that people inside Europe should be having more of, I think, as well as people outside trying to figure out what is Europe? The old question of who do you call when you're trying to call Europe? Single market is a shorthand for the interconnected economies of the 27 countries that make up the European Union. Most, but not all of them, use the euro as their currency. A different most, but not all of them, are part of the Schengen borderless travel framework where you can go from country to country without a border check or without needing to show your passport. Some, but not all of them, are part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the EU is the 27 who've signed on to be part of this economic area known as the single market. They're all in that. That means that they can buy and sell and do basic business stuff with each other without having to do customs from coming outside. It's a customs union at heart. And that's no small thing. It's a big deal. And it's something that the UK really underestimated when it left. The UK thought that they're close by and they've got all these trade ties that it would be fine. And as many people can tell you, doing work with the UK now, especially for small businesses, is not fine. I ordered a cookbook months ago. I still haven't gotten it. It's sitting in a post office somewhere and nobody knows where it is because no one has an incentive to run it down. No one has an incentive to get it to me. And if I do get it, the Belgians might charge me 20 euros just to look at the package plus a couple bucks in extra taxes. It's good to be inside the single market. It's good to be within the EU. So then what does the single market cover and what does it not cover? The EU is at its heart, it's a peace project. It was designed to keep countries from going to war with each other. It's an economic project. It was designed to give people day-to-day reasons to work with each other to minimize their political differences. I happen to think it's been a success. I think that even though we have all these different languages and all these different national laws and things that make conditions very different from locality to locality, the fact that people can trade and work and move around freely, maybe they don't move around as much as they should, but also in the US, we see that mobility is a lot less. That's not necessarily something you can attribute to a single market failure so much as there are other considerations. Anyway, you have this group of 27 countries with a lot of financial incentives to work together, and that brings people into a culture. So that's what the single market is. Now, it doesn't work as well as it could because there are other reasons, like language, why people don't move from country to country. There are reasons why people don't invest from country to country, because if you invest in different country, maybe you don't understand what the rules are for how to take them to court. If something happens to your investment, you don't understand what the rules are for fraud, what the rules are for mis-selling. There are a lot of national particularities that keep people from doing business. But the basic theory is good, and there's so much that people have just gotten used to it.
There are definitely gaps left in the single market. There's also initiatives that started over a decade ago that are not complete, something like the Capital Markets Union, which we've been talking about forever. Report has recommendations on this too. For example, moving to the creation of a savings and investments union. Do you feel like this is the right way to go, or this is just going to duplicate initiatives that we should instead focus on deepening before we try to open a bunch of new doors?
So the Capital Markets Union is definitely a part of the report that I know best. It's an area that I've been working on for 10 years since the official CMU project dropped. And I have to say, I think Letta's proposals are really good and will help it revitalize and wake up. CMU, Capital Markets Union, is a slogan rather than a policy program. It's a phrase that has come to mean we in Europe would like to have a capital market, which is to say we would like to connect the people who have the money to the people who are doing the stuff in a way that works and helps everybody make more money and helps the economy grow. In particular, and post-Brexit, originally this was something that the EU was like, look, we can do this with the UK and keep them part of our core group, even though they're never going to join the euro, which is our currency project. And this is our way to have common financial markets within and with outside the single currency. Well, now the UK is left. However, Capital Markets Union, still necessary. Now that all the debate is about how can the EU be more like the US in terms of connecting the money with the people that can do good things with the money. So it needs to happen. It's hard to make the changes. Part of it is that the original CMU, the original Capital Markets Union paper that came out of the European Commission, really did a global view of all the things that are getting in the way of money getting to where it needs to go. And that included bankruptcy laws. That included tax laws. That included the way people's pension products and tax breaks are structured. That included the way they borrow money to buy their houses. It also included a lot of other things like how do you do a prospectus for an investment? How do you structure certain types of transactions? How do you regulate clearing houses for derivatives or other types of securities. There were so many things. Some things, there have been some progress, but those things are mostly the very technical things that the people in finance world were able to do among themselves. And where the project has really hit a wall is the finance people talk to each other and they kind of agree with each other, but they don't really connect with people outside the finance world bubble. In terms of how to move on next, where I think LETA can help is help people reframe the project in a way that finance world can get more done without having to encounter these very intractable things. So if you take bankruptcy, pensions, taxes, and mortgages, and you set them aside, you say, look, we'd like to have more commonality among these, but these are really hard. They're really baked into the fabric of society. They're really baked into budgets. And budgets, this is very important, budgets are still national at the EU, within the EU. The EU itself has a small budget. It has a small public debt program that is kind of controversial and currently temporary. Basically, all the money comes from the countries. All the countries manage their finances and their taxes independently. So you just have to take that as a given if you're trying to make markets work better. By rebranding it from CMU, Capital Markets Union, to Savings and Investment Union, first of all, you take this phrase that's tired, that's sort of unthinkingly rolling off people's lips, and you give them something new to say. I do not think that is insignificant. I think that actually can be meaningful. And you put savings in the forefront, because this matters to ordinary people. Ordinary people spent a long time keeping their money in the bank, making no interest on it, and wondering, how do we get ahead? People in Europe are very afraid of investing. Stock market investments in particular are seen as speculative and speculation, and it is very difficult for most people to access the type of garden variety mutual fund that anybody in the US can get. One of the strengths of the US system is whether you're inside a tax-protected pension program or retirement savings program like a 401k or an individual retirement account, an IRA, or if you just have some money that, you came into and you want to put it aside, you can put a small amount, a few $100s. You can put a large amount, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. You just dump it into this thing. It's reasonably regulated. It's pretty transparent. It's diversified. It's vanilla. And there isn't something like that you can buy within Europe from anywhere with the same level of certainty and the same level of protections. If you're a motivated consumer with a reasonable amount of money and the wherewithal to figure it out, yeah, okay, it probably is possible. And one of the pushbacks that is already coming from this letter report is you see the sophisticated people in government saying, yeah, but I can get a mutual fund. And they haven't really realized that most of the citizens that they're working with and for don't have that knowledge, or if they can get a mutual fund or an equivalent, it's not a good one. The fees are too high. It's just not good enough. This is an area where Europe can do better. So I'm excited about it.
There's also interesting recommendations, I think, on the financial side, on like stricter enforcement of state aid at the national level in a way that would also enhance EU-level funding support. I think that's obviously the locus of a lot of discussion right now for defense, for example, but that's in the finance bucket. Separately, I think what the report does really well and is really interesting is it also talks about two other things. One is enlargement. It considers the single market through the lens of enlargement. I think that's really, really smart through a series of mechanisms. One of them would be the Enlargement Solidarity Facility. I'm a little curious about how that overlaps at all with IPA funds, because it sounds like we already have something like this. But I think it's great that he's talking about strategically, we have to think about enlargement also as an economic question and making sure that the attractiveness for member states or for future member states remains, while at the same time protecting the single market the way it is now for current members. So I thought that was really important for him to raise that. And the last one is on defense.
And energy. Because energy was the third area of little boxes. I got caught up in my capital markets rhapsody, but we need to talk about energy at some point. But yes, defense is super important and enlargement also super important. So let's talk about those.
Why don't we start with energy? Because on the Eurofile, we love to finish on defense. So we'll start with energy and then address the defense question.
So LETA calls for a single electricity market. which is an area that my Bruegel colleagues, Georg Zachman and Simone Italia Pietra, have worked on extensively. They have a great paper on how this could work and how to make it go. And it is a brilliant idea, and it would make such a big difference. It's going to be hard. The European grid is not connected as well as it could be, particularly as we move away from fossil fuels, which of course are easy to move around in trucks and through pipes. And we move to renewables, where you need different types of energy storage, if at all. It's just technically harder. And then also you have some geographic limitations. Like, notoriously, it's very hard to move electricity from France to Spain and back. And in situations where they have been able to move electricity from France to Spain and back, people have been able to make money and save money, and it's all worked out great, but it's been very localized. So for Letta to put that out there, to have some specific recommendations on how to do that and where to get started, is very important. And it does tie into the state aid debate, like you were saying. Europe, to my mind, has more capacity to use global capital markets, so global investors' money, to fix itself up than it's been doing. And until the pandemic, it was just off the table because it meant selling bonds, and selling bonds meant issuing debt, and debt is associated with shame, and people don't like it. I believe that a public debt in a developed country with a credible central bank and other factors is one of the best things you can have. The U.S. public debt has been called Hamilton's gift or Hamilton's blessing. It's funny you mentioned Simpson Bowles. Even before you get into that report, you have to start from the idea of what is the debt, what's it for? Europe is just so far behind the U.S. on that because they haven't made that leap yet, that public debt, selling bonds, is just infrastructure. It's just like wires in the ground. When you put wires in the ground, they can catch on fire. But we don't spend all of our time talking about fires. We spend our time talking about power. And when you sell bonds, you should be talking about the good things you can do with bonds. Now, you do have to make sure they don't catch on fire. Like, you can't leave that part out. But it doesn't have to be the center of every conversation.
Unless Germany is one of your member states, obviously.
Well, they're working on it. I give Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, huge credit for going ahead with the pandemic borrowing program. I give the German people a lot of credit for their evolution through the financial crisis, of realizing that it is in everyone's interest to put money into saving the EU. They took longer to get there than would have been ideal, but they got there. They did save Greece. Greece was like a leaky roof. If they'd fixed it right the first time, it would have cost them a lot less, but they couldn't bring themselves to write the check. So they didn't. So they had to do more. But in the end, they got it done. Greece is doing great right now. It's fulfilling many of the conditions that they set out. It's back working with the global economy. Yes, there's things that they could work on. Yes, they've got their issues. We've all got our issues, but the EU is stronger with Greece in it, and with the work that they did to help Greece and the other countries that were affected during the euro crisis get back on their feet.
On the energy side, when you talk about the grid, I think the report has Letta has a really interesting framing at the top on the connectivity of high-speed rail. I think that's a perfect analogy for all of the different issues that we're talking about here, and the grid in particular. He talks about how you can go from Amsterdam to Brussels to Paris, any other major European capital. You can't take a high-speed train directly. You have to connect through Cologne or any other, not random city, but just not a major capital. So I think for the grid, that is also a great analogy. But why don't we move then from energy to defense? Because I think Letta's genius in that is that he loops that in as well. And that is a key debate in Europe right now, obviously because of Ukraine. And he talks about Ukraine as a fundamental shift in how European security will need to be approached, including through investments, obviously for the defense industry, defense industrial complex, etc. I'm curious what you make of his propositions on that front. He talks about a common market for security and defense industry. Do you see that working to enhance industrial capacity? Are there other tools that he mentions that we should be aware of?
When you think about the EU and defense, I find it helpful to sort of unpack it a little bit. In one bucket, you have procurement, just like how do you buy this stuff? And that's where having more of a single market and more of a common approach would definitely help. If you place a bulk order, you get a better deal. That's an oversimplification, but there are certainly areas where the EU can do that. The second bucket is the innovation area. And this is where Europe has struggled in the past, but I think is trying to turn things around. It's very tempting to say, oh, the Americans are building a 4-engine cargo plane. We want a 4-engine cargo plane too, instead of thinking, what do we really need? What is something that will really help us with our own defense needs? The combination of having an active shooting war going on for 2 years now on the border, and having U.S. politics in such an uncertain and volatile place where, depending on how an election goes, support can really swing one way or the other in a hurry. Also, congressional gridlock doesn't help. You can't really count on the U.S. like you could. You don't have to write off the U.S. yet, and I hope never will have to, but Europe is more faced than it has ever been before with the need to take care of its own defense. So you have this question of like, what capabilities do we really need, and how are we going to do that? And then the third question is, how are we going to pay for it? And this is where I diverge from Letta. Not to say that any of his ideas are bad, but I think the only way to talk about who's going to pay for it is to look at money as a system. EU money is not going to be able to pay for EU level defense purchases. There is no way that the member states are going to allow for any kind of transfer. You know, the Germans are not going to help sell bonds to buy fighters for Greece, let alone for fighters for other countries on other borders and things like that. So instead, you got to spend the EU money on stuff that's good for everybody, like trains, like power grids, like the clean transition, like hydrogen storage, all these things. This is stuff that is very economic, that would help everybody, that it's much easier to justify doing either as a one-off, because right now Europe is in a point where it's willing to borrow collectively for anything it can justify as a one-off investment, but not for day-to-day things like paying salaries. So fine, let's do a bunch of one-offs. Let's fix the power grid. Let's put in the trains. Let's do all this stuff. And then if that stuff is being handled more at the EU level and those things are happening, countries have more room on their own balance sheets to make their defense spending decisions. And that's the direction that I think it has to go to be effective.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'll probably quibble a little bit. I mean, my view is actually Ukraine becomes the need to arm Ukraine, and that the fact that the Europeans haven't really reckoned with the fact that wars are incredibly costly. And, you know, we in the United States just recognize that to support our foreign policy endeavors, we just have to conjure money, and we, you know, have fights about the right things, essentially the supplemental, which is more than 60 billion for Ukraine. Well, you know, we have fights over Taurus missile use, and when actually what needs to be fought over is how you get 60 billion at the European level, or, you know, collectively amongst Europeans to start putting money on contracts. Because there's a lot of challenges here. And I think that's the way that Europe begins on defense. It's a very practical thing. How do we put money toward building more ammo for Ukraine? And then suddenly you start producing, you have excess, you need to then, store it somewhere. And that's kind of a slippery slope.
It's a really interesting framing, because to me, giving money to Ukraine is a separate question financially than building up Europe's own armies. Ukraine definitely needs the money. The EU is definitely borrowing in capital markets to do it. Interestingly, the capital market borrowing for Ukraine is a lot less controversial than some of the other stuff. So I would agree with everything you said and just say that is a little bit separate from the idea of how do the individual countries build up their own defense capacities.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. I mean, I think the major problem with European defense is it doesn't exist, and that you have a bunch of countries. And this gets to something that Letta pointed to, and maybe as a sort of final question, or final two questions. One of the things he pointed to was that we have all these national firms. That's incredibly true on defense, where the parochialism and the inefficiencies, for example, the Czechs and the Slovaks divesting their old Soviet equipment. Then when they went to buy a new Swedish infantry fighting vehicle, it's like actually different because they needed the Czech firm and the Slovak firm to get different parts. So they're not actually interchangeable systems the way they were, during the Soviet era. And this is two countries that used to be the same country. And we have that across the EU. So basically you have European forces that can't actually fight together because they don't really operate the same equipment. And while they technically could, means these are interoperable. If you're going to deploy Europeans together, they can't actually do it. Anyway, I'm on a rant, but I want to maybe close by asking you about how you get, European companies to sort of level up, so to speak, or become European companies. There's examples of this on the defense side, Airbus and MBDA, where, to sort of solve kind of collective German-French challenges and creating more scale. Letta points to that. Is that something we'll see? And maybe as a final, the second part, final closing question, what impact will this have? Is this a roadmap? Right now we're about to have European elections in a few weeks. Is this sort of a roadmap for the next commission? Do you think this will sort of lay out the agenda that the commission and the EU is going to sort of try to implement going forward? Or is this sort of a Simpson-Bowles style report that sort of sits on the shelf and either, some parts get implemented, but most of it gets ignored? I'm curious for your take on what are the broader ramifications of going forward.
I think it's going to be more relevant than Simpson-Bowles, yet it will not be a roadmap per se. It's going to be a menu. It's going to be a reference book. When people come in, they're going to say, we need a policy agenda. We need some ideas. And they're going to go get this letter report and they're going to look down at a lot of this stuff or issues that you could have talked about them 5 years ago. You could talk about them 5 years from now. They're going to be relevant. The letter report has vetted these issues. And if you pick something that's in that book, it's going to have some intellectual heft behind it. You may want to add your own stamp to it. You may want to do your own thing. But it's created a repository for policymakers to get some ideas about how to get some things done. And I think that is a real gift. Frankly, I wasn't expecting it to be so useful along those lines. We have another big report coming out on European competitiveness coming from Mario Draghi, and that will come, another former Italian prime minister, among other jobs that Draghi is famous for. That will come later in the year, in the summer probably. Draghi will talk more about this issue of European champions. Now, he has not telegraphed what he's going to say. I would say that broadly speaking, the concept of a champion industry has not served Europe well. It has protected the industries that have been there for a long time. I was at a dinner recently where somebody pointed out that the top 5 innovating European companies now and 20 years ago are basically the same companies, whereas in the US, they're a completely different list. Efforts, particularly on the civilian side, to have these mega mergers to create, these giant pan-European manufacturing companies, those did not turn out to be a good idea. They were not successes. People even now say, if only we'd had them, maybe we'd be beating the US. No, if your 2 big manufacturing companies had merged, you would still not be beating Silicon Valley. There's this sense of kind of propping things up. And there's a lot of tension right now between the French, who are really doubling down on, let's go get some champions and go fight. We got to get serious. We got to have our place in the world. And the rest of Europe, frankly, which is saying we would like to be competitive, but that doesn't mean a bunch of bigger French companies or bigger German companies or bigger Italian companies, because that's sort of where the locus is. Now, defense is trickier. And defense doesn't have the role models. This is important. When you're talking about technology and innovation, you can look to Silicon Valley. You can point to other places in the world where there's been a lot of innovation. I spent 3 years writing about the Pentagon every day, and I can tell you that U.S. defense contracting did not get better when there was consolidation. It did not get better when there was merging, when suddenly you had everybody working together on these bulk contracts, when you had prime contractors supposedly ensuring standards. These were all ideas that you could argue were worth trying, but none of them particularly worked well. So for Europe trying to do this also, if anything, they might want to not do some of the things that the US tried. As with any really big investment, if you can only buy it once, you have different constraints than if you can buy it 5 times. And when I say it, I almost mean a chunk of industry. That's going to be really hard. And it's not just a question of standards. Europe is pretty good at standard settings. If they decide, we're going to get together and we're going to make sure that all the pilots are certified in each other's planes, that everybody flying a Hornet and a Joint Strike Fighter has some ability to shift back and forth, that's something you can do. But if you're going to sit here and say, how are we going to get, the Italian radio systems and radar people working with the German hardcore manufacturers, working with the French rockets people, that's bigger than Europe. That's a bigger problem. It would be great if they can figure it out. But I think it's a little too simplistic to say this is a European problem. That's the reason that Europe doesn't have good defense, is because they haven't solved contracting, because nobody's solved contracting. Great way to end it, because that is definitely true. Oftentimes I have Europeans being like, well, we need to be more like the US. And I'm like, in certain ways, but the Pentagon has all sorts of problems, as you know. Rebecca Christie, thank you so much for joining us on the Eurofile. It was a great conversation. Learned a ton. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Please make sure to check out some of Rebecca's latest work at Reuters and at Bruegel on the European signal market and its competitiveness. You can find links to all of this in the episode description. As always, our thanks to our producer, Sean Falk, and to Otto Svensson for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.